Hi everyone, my wife Stacy and I decided to make a YouTube channel with some of our downtime during the pandemic. We're going to be recording some of our projects of crafts and hobbies and various things we do around the house, and thought we'd take you guys along on the journey. For the first video on the channel, I decided to do a shop upgrade. A lot of the things that we make use a table saw around here for some reason at our house. A lot of wood gets cut, and a lot of dust comes from the blade, and if you don't have an overarm dust collector, which are expensive to buy, it just kind of flies right at your face. So I have some goggles I can put on, but wearing glasses, it's kind of a hassle. And then usually I'll wear a respirator to keep all of that out of my nose and lungs. And that's good to do, and I'm sure I'm still going to have to do that for some stuff. But I decided to build this overarm dust collector to kind of help with the problem and reduce some of the dust in the air that gets kicked up when you are cutting lumber on a table saw. When you don't have an overarm dust collector, the dust basically gets picked up by the saw blade and just launched forward by the teeth. This has a dust collection tube that goes down to the regular dust collector that plugs into the back of the table saw. But it also has a plastic shield on the front to kind of collect the dust. And it works for two things. One, it helps position the suction down towards the blade, but it also catches those particles as they get flung off the blade and redirects them down so they don't come at your face. So either the dust collector overarm is going to pick it up, or built into the table saw will pick it up down below the blade. I built this to be freestanding next to the table saw. I didn't want to have to mount it to the table saw or mount it to the ceiling like I've seen some other ones done. I've considered it, but I put the table saw on wheels so that I could move it around the workshop. And I want this to be able to follow it around without having to remount something to the roof, or remount something to the table saw. So it's freestanding, and that's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because it makes it more mobile. It's a bad thing because it's a little bit movable. And that's okay. You shouldn't really be bumping into it too much when you're cutting stuff on the table saw anyways. But it's just something to note. I'll probably have to set this up or down a little bit higher than I want so that I don't actually bump into it when I'm using it. And while that's okay, it reduces the amount of suction that's going to be directly over the board. My initial cuts with it, I've probably done about 4 or 5. It's worked fine. I've had the dust collection on for the bottom of the saw and for the overarm section, and I haven't had to wear a respirator or a dust mask. So here's how I made it. I start out most of my projects by designing them in SketchUp. Then I go to the garage and start marking out the pieces, marking the length, sometimes the width, but usually just the length. Then I go to the radial arm saw and cut them down to length. Sometimes there's a lot of pieces, sometimes there's a few. Sometimes I got to come back more than once, but I try to cut them all down to length first. Then I move over to the table saw and I rip them to width. Depending on how many pieces you can get out, that's where you have to go back to the radial arm saw and cut them again. Sometimes you have a really long piece and you gotta cut 3 or 4 from that. You can see there's quite a bit of dust coming up from the table saw while I'm cutting. That's kind of what I'm trying to help cut down on with the overarm dust collector. Cutting the corners off of these here is kind of for aesthetics and kind of for functionality. Starting the assembly, I do pre-drill the holes, especially on the pine, on the ends. I don't want to split anything in half when I'm putting a screw in. The section I'm working on here is the base section. I figured to start from the bottom, work my way up. I thought 2 screws for the base would be enough for the legs to keep it from twisting on that back piece, but it wasn't. Later I come back and add a piece in to try and help it keep from rolling against the feet
keep it 90 degrees in both directions. Pieces I'm putting on here are the supports for the upright section to keep it vertical 90 degrees from left to right as well. Just checking, make sure everything's square before I screw it in. Next I move on to the overarm part of the assembly. This is the part that's going to hang over the saw blade. In hindsight, I probably could have used less screws, but I've got them, and it's nice and rigid in the areas where there's extra screws, so I don't feel they're wasted, just maybe a little overkill. Again, just checking that everything's 90 degrees. What you don't see, because it's kind of hard to show on camera, but between the cuts here, I do actually get out my phone and reference a SketchUp document just to make sure I'm overlapping the pieces in the right direction, or getting the right measurements, or just that it's looking like the SketchUp model. Here again, just checking for 90 degrees. I like to use clamps every once in a while when I don't want something to move. I mean, that's kind of the point, but what I mean is the screws kind of have a habit of pulling the wood out of where you want it to be. You know, wood's, I mean, it's not living anymore, but it was living, and every piece has a life of its own. So when you put a screw into a piece of wood, it doesn't always go in straight unless you pre-drill the entire length of the hole. So in order to keep it from pulling stuff out of alignment, I will pre-drill, or I'll clamp it down. Here I've got the base all assembled out in front of the table saw, and I'm just giving it a shake, seeing how it feels. It's a little bit more flexible than I wanted, but I think it's perfectly usable. Next I move on to assembling the actual piece that slides up and down on the rail over the table saw blade. I'm just marking the pieces where I think the bolt's going to go, leaving some room for the plexiglass. I don't feel like I had enough room, so between cuts here I actually go trim those half-inch plywood pieces just a little bit more to make more room for the plexiglass. I want to leave enough room to put a hole for a screw. Something you'll see me here doing is using my finger as a guide on the side of the wood with the pencil. I'm not sure where I picked this up. I'm sure it was watching one of the YouTube videos. I watch quite a few woodworking videos myself, and it's just an easy way to reference the same measurement 3 or 4 times if you're making it on different pieces. You just hold the pencil and then kind of like lock that in your fingers, and then you can use that finger to slide on the piece of wood. And as long as you don't let go of the pencil, you can move to another piece of wood and make pretty much the same measurement. Or if you want to, you can just slide all the way down, reset, slide all the way down, and it's just a quick way instead of having to get out a straight edge to make straight lines on wood. Obviously, don't do that with a really rough piece of wood. You don't want to get a splinter, but if you feel the wood is smooth enough, or if your hands are calloused enough, you can slide along the edge. Wish there was a easier way to clamp down pieces so you could cut that all at once, but working with what I got, you got to just clamp it, flip it, clamp it, and then the piece falls out. I'm sliding the bolt back and forth. I want to make sure there's enough clearance, marking where there's not enough room, and then I'm just kind of taking a little bit more away with the jigsaw. I had lost some footage here of actually cutting the plexiglass from a larger sheet, but after I got those 2 pieces cut, I'm just here on the bandsaw trimming the round section for the front side of where the blade will be. Just trying to sand those smooth. There's a little bit of double-sided stick tape holding both of the sides together, trying to get them smooth and just the same size. And anytime you're working with plexiglass, if you're going to screw it to something, you want to pre-drill the holes. Otherwise, you'll shatter it when you put the screw through it. So I pre-drill all the holes and then I countersink them. I'm just using 3/4 inch drywall screws, so they're not going to be countersunk perfectly, but enough that they'll seat without binding against the plastic and cracking it. Now I'm just assembling the main head unit, putting the plexiglass onto the frame. I like to use a scratch awl anytime I'm putting a screw in and I want to be precise. If you don't get the hole centered exactly, you can actually move the piece that you're trying to attach. So I just like to get that scratch awl out and put a nice little hole right where I want the head of my screw to start. Got my heat gun out. Gonna try to bend this plexiglass around a piece here. I just kind of scratched a line on a piece of 2x4, cut that out on the bandsaw, and now I'm just going to form the plexiglass to that so that it matches the front side. Just heating it up, bending it, see how flexible it is. Do that a few times and then just kind of move around the curve. The piece is longer than I need. The template that I'm bending against is the actual size. So once I get this bent, I'm just going to mark a line, score them with a razor knife, and then snap them off against the edge of the workbench. This is the top part of that piece we were just working on, the head unit. I just took it out of the assembly so that I could drill a hole for the vacuum hose to go into. It's quite a close cut here. There's maybe 1/8 of an inch on one side and a little bit less on the other, but it's still strong enough to get the hose in there. There really isn't any flex in it, but I would have liked that to have been a little thicker. Now I'm just mixing some epoxy up. It's 5-minute epoxy to put the front piece on. It is oversized for width. I'm not overly concerned with it being wider than the head unit itself. It's not going to affect the functionality of it at all. Now I'm just assembling the whole thing together. You can kind of see I added a back piece to that as well, and that's just to keep it from tilting forwards off of the rail that it's sliding up and down on. There's some washers underneath those screws just to kind of give it a little bit of tension without being too tight. And then there's washers on the left and right side of that rail as well, just to take up a little bit of space, make sure it doesn't wiggle on that rail. And you can see it here, just fully assembled. You can see the base here where I added the extra support for rigidity and a piece on the back just to kind of weigh it down and keep it from moving. I'm just cutting a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood here. Wanted to see what kind of dust collection I would have with it. And I'm pretty happy. I don't get a lot of dust coming up with it at all. The pine, however, did have a lot more dust, and you can see that coming out the side. That's a 2x4 that I've actually cut in half on the bandsaw previously.
Overall, I'm happy with how it came out. I definitely make it again. It's going to save me some dust. I won't be able to use it for everything that I cut on the table saw, but I'll be able to use it for a good majority. Would I recommend you guys make something like this? Absolutely. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than what I had? Yes. And that's really what I'm after, is trying to make something better every time that I make something. Maybe I'll modify it in the future. Maybe I'll remake it completely. But for now, it's better than what I had, and that's good enough for me. If you enjoy the content you just watched, stay tuned for more. My wife and I are going to be doing various craft projects around the house, more shop upgrades, some woodworking projects, some stuff with resin. We're going to be going out for a trip to the garden. If you do like it, again, stay tuned, but also like, comment, subscribe. We're going to be listening in our comment section, answering any questions that come through. And if you have any advice or projects you want to see, drop it down there for us as well. Thanks.